Kamala Harris leaned forward at the Senate Judiciary hearing and pointed her finger at Vivek Ramaswamy with prosecutorial authority. "You're nothing but a threat to democracy with dangerous extremist agenda," she declared with political conviction. Harris's establishment audience nodded approvingly, thinking their vice president had delivered the perfect constitutional takedown. But what Harris didn't know was that Vivek had researched her entire prosecutor corruption record and Willie Brown affair scandal. Vivek's response about Harris's political climbing career would completely destroy her credibility and expose the ultimate corrupt politician. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room was packed with tension on this sweltering July morning in Washington. The ornate chamber, with its marble columns and formal portraits of past justices, had witnessed countless constitutional debates throughout American history, but what was about to unfold would become one of the most explosive confrontations between establishment politics and constitutional conservatism. The hearing was focused on judicial nominations and constitutional interpretation, topics that had become increasingly polarized as progressive and conservative legal philosophies clashed over the future direction of American jurisprudence. The committee had invited various legal experts and public figures to testify about the qualifications and judicial philosophy of recent nominees. Kamala Harris sat at her position on the committee with the confidence that had carried her from California prosecutor to Vice President of the United States. Her perfectly styled appearance and authoritative demeanor projected the image of someone who had successfully navigated the highest levels of American legal and political systems. Since her rise to national prominence, Harris had built her political brand on aggressive questioning and prosecutorial style attacks that made her a favorite among progressive activists who appreciated her willingness to confront conservative figures with pointed accusations about their commitment to democratic institutions and constitutional principles. Across the witness table sat Vivek Ramaswamy, who had been invited to provide perspectives on constitutional originalism and the role of the judiciary in American governance. He wore a sharp navy suit, his demeanor calm but alert, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had studied constitutional law at Harvard and built successful businesses based on understanding complex legal frameworks. The hearing had proceeded through various discussions about judicial philosophy, constitutional interpretation, and the balance between federal and state authority. Most of the questioning had been predictably partisan, with Democratic senators challenging conservative witnesses, while Republican senators offered supportive questioning. That's when Harris decided to make her move. She had been observing Vivek throughout the hearing, clearly viewing him as a representative of conservative constitutional thinking that she believed posed a threat to progressive legal achievements. Harris sensed an opportunity to establish her credentials as a defender of democratic institutions when the discussion turned to the question of how constitutional interpretation affected democratic governance. "Mr. Ramaswamy," Harris began, her voice taking on that familiar prosecutorial tone that had made her famous during confirmation hearings. "I want to ask you about some of the statements you've made regarding constitutional interpretation and the role of federal institutions in protecting democratic rights." The setup was classic Harris, using her legal background to frame questions that would paint conservative constitutional thinking as dangerous to democratic institutions. The committee room fell silent as senators and observers recognized that Harris was preparing for one of her signature confrontational moments. "You've made statements questioning the authority of federal agencies to enforce civil rights protections," Harris continued, her voice growing more pointed. "You've criticized Supreme Court decisions that expanded constitutional protections for marginalized communities. You've promoted legal theories that would roll back decades of progress in constitutional interpretation." The accusations were becoming more serious, and everyone in the committee room could sense that Harris was building toward a direct attack on Vivek's constitutional philosophy and political positions. "You represent a dangerous strain of constitutional thinking that threatens the very foundations of our democratic system," Harris said, her voice rising with the kind of moral authority that had made her popular among progressive legal scholars. "Your interpretations of constitutional law would undermine protections for voting rights, civil rights, and the basic democratic principles that make America a beacon of freedom for the world." The room was growing tense and Democratic committee members were leaning forward with anticipation, ready for Harris to deliver another memorable takedown of conservative constitutional thinking. "Mr. Ramaswamy," Harris said, leaning forward with prosecutorial intensity, her voice carrying the full weight of her position as vice president, "I have to ask you directly. How do you justify promoting constitutional interpretations that would threaten democratic institutions? How do you reconcile your legal training with advocacy for positions that would harm the constitutional protections that millions of Americans depend on?" The confrontation was now completely personal, transforming what should have been a discussion about judicial philosophy into a direct attack on Vivek's character and motivations. "You're nothing but a threat to democracy with dangerous extremist agenda," Harris declared, her voice echoing through the committee room with prosecutorial authority. "You use your legal credentials and business success to legitimize constitutional interpretations that would roll back civil rights, undermine democratic institutions, and threaten the progress we've made toward a more perfect union." The committee room erupted in murmurs from Democratic supporters, and Harris sat back with satisfaction, clearly expecting her attack to be received as a powerful defense of constitutional democracy against conservative extremism. But what Harris didn't realize was that she had just made a catastrophic miscalculation. She had assumed that her prosecutorial background and her position as vice president would be enough to intimidate someone she clearly viewed as just another conservative activist. She had no idea that she was about to confront someone who had done extensive research on her own record of prosecutorial misconduct and political corruption. "Madam Vice President," Vivek said, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel that made everyone in the committee room pay attention, "I appreciate your concern about threats to democracy and constitutional governance. I really do. But I have to ask you something, and I think the American people deserve to hear your answer." The tone of the confrontation was shifting, and Harris's confident expression began to falter slightly. She had expected Vivek to become defensive about his constitutional philosophy or to offer some weak justification that would only make her attack look stronger. Instead, he was turning the tables and going on the offensive. "You just called me a threat to democracy with a dangerous extremist agenda," Vivek continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You suggested that my constitutional interpretations threaten democratic institutions and civil rights protections. You positioned yourself as a defender of constitutional democracy against extremist thinking." He paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze steady and unwavering. "But I have to ask you, Madam Vice President, what exactly in your own record as a prosecutor and politician qualifies you to lecture anyone about threats to democracy? What in your own approach to law enforcement and political advancement demonstrates the kind of constitutional integrity you claim to defend?" The question hit the committee room like a thunderbolt, and the audience fell into an uncomfortable silence. This wasn't how these hearings usually went. Government officials were supposed to be able to attack witnesses without having their own records questioned in return. "Because when I look at your record as a prosecutor in California," Vivek continued, his voice carrying across the committee room with unmistakable authority, "I don't see someone who defended constitutional rights and democratic principles. I see someone who consistently violated the constitutional rights of defendants, who suppressed evidence, who pursued prosecutions that advanced your political career rather than serving justice." He pulled out a document from his folder, and the gesture was both theatrical and ominous. "Let me share some facts about your prosecutorial record with this committee. As Attorney General of California, you were responsible for one of the most corrupt and unconstitutional approaches to criminal justice in recent American history." The committee room was dead silent now, the atmosphere completely transformed from democratic celebration to shocked attention. Harris sat rigid in her chair, her earlier confidence evaporating as she realized where this was heading. "You withheld evidence that would have exonerated defendants," Vivek continued, consulting his document. "Your office was repeatedly sanctioned by courts for prosecutorial misconduct. You pursued cases that you knew were based on false evidence because the convictions would advance your political ambitions. The specific accusations of prosecutorial misconduct were devastating because they highlighted systematic violations of constitutional rights under Harris's leadership. The Innocence Project documented over 50 cases where your office suppressed exculpatory evidence, Vivek said, his voice rising with conviction. 50 cases, Madam Vice President, where you violated the constitutional rights of defendants, where you chose political advancement over constitutional integrity, where you demonstrated exactly the kind of threat to democratic institutions that you now claim to oppose. The systematic pattern of constitutional violations was being exposed in real time, and everyone in the room could see how Harris's accusations had backfired spectacularly. But that's not the worst part of your record, Vivek continued, pulling out another document. Let's talk about how you built your political career, how you gained the positions that allowed you to violate constitutional rights on such a systematic scale. The attack was shifting to Harris's personal conduct and the foundation of her political rise. Let's talk about Willie Brown, Vivek said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. The married Speaker of the California Assembly, who was 30 years older than you, who appointed you to lucrative state positions in exchange for your personal relationship with him. The committee room was completely silent now, everyone recognizing the explosive nature of the accusations being made against the sitting vice president. You had an affair with a married man who held power over your career advancement, Vivek continued, and he used that power to give you positions that launched your political career. That's not just personal misconduct, Madam Vice President. That's corruption. That's using personal relationships to gain political power through means that would be illegal in most other contexts. The corruption accusations were particularly damaging because they went to the heart of Harris's qualifications and the legitimacy of her political rise. Willie Brown appointed you to the California Medical Assistance Commission, a position that paid $99,000 per year for part-time work, Vivek said, consulting his document. He then appointed you to the Unemployment Insurance Appeals Board, another highly paid position that required minimal qualifications. These weren't merit-based appointments, Madam Vice President. These were payoffs for personal services. The specific details of the corruption were devastating because they showed how Harris had used personal relationships rather than qualifications to advance her career. But here's what makes it even worse, Vivek continued, his momentum building. While you were building your career through personal relationships with powerful men, you were simultaneously positioning yourself as a champion of women's rights and ethical governance. You were using corruption to gain power while claiming to fight against the very kind of system that made your success possible. The hypocrisy was being exposed in real time, showing how Harris's public image contradicted her actual behavior and career trajectory. And let's talk about your record as District Attorney of San Francisco, Vivek said, pulling out what appeared to be his most damaging evidence. You campaigned on criminal justice reform and constitutional rights, but your actual record shows consistent violations of both. The pattern of saying one thing while doing another was being documented, showing Harris's systematic dishonesty about her own record. You defended prosecutorial misconduct in your office, Vivek continued. When your prosecutors were caught withholding evidence, suppressing testimony, and violating defendants' constitutional rights, you defended them rather than holding them accountable. You prioritized your office's conviction rate over constitutional integrity. The institutional corruption under Harris's leadership was being exposed, showing how she had created a culture of constitutional violations rather than constitutional protection. You opposed DNA testing that would have exonerated wrongfully convicted defendants, Vivek said, his voice taking on a tone of genuine outrage. You fought against evidence that would have proven innocence because admitting prosecutorial errors would have damaged your political ambitions. The opposition to exonerating evidence was particularly damaging because it showed Harris actively working against constitutional justice when it conflicted with her political interests. But perhaps most revealing, Vivek continued, is your record on civil liberties and constitutional rights during your time as Attorney General. You defended unconstitutional surveillance programs. You opposed transparency measures that would have exposed government misconduct. You consistently chose government power over individual constitutional rights. The systematic opposition to constitutional protections was being documented, showing how Harris's record contradicted her claims to defend democratic institutions. You supported asset forfeiture programs that allowed law enforcement to seize property without due process, Vivek said. You defended police misconduct cases rather than holding officers accountable for constitutional violations. You consistently prioritized government power over the constitutional rights you now claim to champion. The pattern of supporting government overreach while claiming to defend constitutional rights was being exposed as fundamentally hypocritical. So when you call me a threat to democracy, Vivek said, his voice reaching a crescendo, I have to ask, what's more of a threat to democratic institutions? Someone who advocates for constitutional originalism and limited government? Or someone who built their career through corruption and then systematically violated constitutional rights while in power? The comparison was devastating because it highlighted the fundamental difference between constitutional philosophy and actual constitutional violations. You want to know what a real threat to democracy looks like? Vivek asked, his voice carrying the weight of documented evidence. It's a prosecutor who withholds evidence to maintain conviction rates. It's an attorney general who opposes DNA testing that would exonerate the innocent. It's a politician who built their career through corrupt relationships and then lectures others about constitutional integrity. The role reversal was complete, and everyone in the committee room could see how Harris's accusations had exposed her own record of actual threats to constitutional governance. You called my constitutional philosophy extremist, Vivek continued. But extremism is using prosecutorial power to advance political ambitions at the expense of constitutional rights. Extremism is building a career through corruption while claiming to fight corruption. Extremism is violating the constitutional rights of defendants while lecturing others about threats to democracy. The systematic exposure of Harris's hypocrisy was particularly effective because it used her own standards against her, showing how her behavior contradicted her rhetoric. And let's talk about your approach to political opposition, Vivek said, pulling out his phone. As vice president, you've consistently supported efforts to criminalize political dissent, to use government power to silence critics, to weaponize federal agencies against political opponents. The abuse of power as vice president was being highlighted, showing how Harris's threats to democracy extended beyond her prosecutorial career. You've supported efforts to prosecute parents who speak out at school board meetings, Vivek continued. You've backed initiatives to use federal law enforcement against political protesters. You've endorsed using government power to silence voices that challenge progressive orthodoxy. The pattern of weaponizing government against political opposition was being documented, showing how Harris's approach to democracy was fundamentally authoritarian. That's not defending democracy, Madam Vice President, Vivek said, his voice rising with conviction. That's using democratic institutions to suppress democratic dissent. That's exactly the kind of authoritarian behavior that actually threatens constitutional governance. The fundamental threat to democratic norms was being articulated clearly, showing how Harris's approach represented everything she claimed to oppose. So, Madam Vice President, Vivek said, beginning to conclude his response, the next time you want to call someone a threat to democracy, maybe you should examine your own record of constitutional violations and corruption. The next time you want to lecture someone about extremist agendas, maybe you should consider whether your own approach to government power represents the kind of extremism that actually threatens American institutions. He gathered his thoughts for his final statement. And the next time you want to attack someone's constitutional philosophy, maybe you should ask yourself whether Americans are better served by originalist interpretations that limit government power or by politicians who use government power to advance their own careers at the expense of constitutional rights. His final words would echo in that committee room long after the hearing was over. I'll keep defending constitutional principles that protect individual rights against government overreach. You can keep using government power to advance political agendas while lecturing others about threats to democracy. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Harris sat motionless in her chair, her prosecutorial authority completely destroyed by the exposure of her own record of constitutional violations and political corruption. Her attack on constitutional conservatism had backfired spectacularly. revealing her own history of threatening the very democratic institutions she claimed to defend. The committee room sat in stunned silence, many clearly recognizing that they had just witnessed a fundamental shift in the power dynamic between government officials and the citizens they were supposed to serve. The confrontation had exposed not just Harris's individual failures, but the broader problem of politicians who used accusations of extremism to hide their own authoritarian behavior. The confrontation between Vivek Ramaswamy and Kamala Harris had exposed something crucial about the current state of American politics: the willingness of establishment politicians to use accusations of extremism and threats to democracy to silence opposition, while engaging in the very behavior they claim to oppose. It had highlighted how politicians who built their careers through corruption and constitutional violations often position themselves as defenders of democratic institutions while actually representing the greatest threats to constitutional governance. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that all the political authority in the world couldn't overcome the simple truth that defending democracy required actually respecting constitutional rights rather than just claiming to do so, and that the American people deserved leaders who lived by constitutional principles rather than politicians who violated them while lecturing others about constitutional integrity. The age of unquestioned political authority based on accusations of extremism was over. The age of demanding actual constitutional integrity from government officials had begun. And it had started with an entrepreneur from Ohio who had the courage to challenge a corrupt vice president with the most powerful weapon in American politics: the truth about her own record of constitutional violations and political corruption.